With no company seemingly willing to commit to an official new $200 graphics card, I decided to put to the test AMD's previous cards that have been marketed for $200. There's the Radeon 480 from 2016, the Radeon 5500 XT from 2019, and the Radeon 6500 XT from 2021. Those of you who know your graphics cards will understand why this comparison is so interesting, because they're all roughly the same price and performance, but it's been achieved by cutting more modern cards down more and more, sometimes with disastrous results. I compared these three cards across a number of demanding games at three different graphics presets. I tested lowest settings just to see if they could run it, then I tested optimized settings, sort of like mid to high settings where it would be reasonable to expect good performance and visuals. And then I tested ultra quality just to see if these cards have what it takes to truly max out these games. And before I start, let me complain again about how most reviews only test ultra quality. I get that it's done to challenge the fastest and most expensive cards out there, and to be able to compare different cards against one another, but for people buying these cards to actually use them, ultra settings are totally redundant. Since when have games been about maxing out the quality settings? Why is a game considered unplayable if it's unplayable at ultra quality? Surely it should be considered unplayable if it's unable to be run at lowest settings. So yeah, here's to ushering in a new era where games are actually tested at sensible, good-looking presets that don't just load in the 8K textures and 16 times anisotropic filtering just for the hell of it. Hogwarts Legacy first, as an example of a new, very pretty but notoriously demanding title. This is how it looks at ultra quality. Just kidding, this is lowest presets. Still looks quite nice, doesn't it? Now for a comparison. On the left is lowest everything, and on the right, highest preset everything. I didn't put ray tracing on because only one graphics card in this video supports it, so there's no point when I'm trying to compare different cards. But the point is, the graphical difference on display here isn't massive, and my optimized preset will look somewhere between the two. I typically try to avoid lowest settings in games just because this tends to be where the major graphical sacrifices are made, but once you reach medium in modern titles, I find that games typically look pretty good. It's obviously dependent on the title, but in general, it's a long way from the blobathlon that lower settings were 15-20 years ago. And here are all my results for all three cards at all three graphical qualities tested. Yes, this is a lot of data to take in all at once. Yes, my silly little mind still insists that this is the best way to display this data. The red charts are Radeon 480 results, the yellows the 5500s, and the blue is the 6500 XT's results. Why these colours? They're just colours. Don't read into it any further. I've also included the 1% lows in these same colours, but darker, because again, in my silly little mind, this sort of made sense. So let's interpret these results. At lowest graphic settings, all cards managed more than 60 FPS average, and the 6500 XT achieved over 60 for its 1% minimum result as well. Moving across to the optimized graphics preset, all three cards remained above 60 FPS average, which for this game I used medium settings. This video's description details specifics should you want to know more. I don't want to clog up the rest of this video with specifics. And when a game supported it, like this one does, I would use FSR 2 for my testing, because it seems sensible to use it if it's available and an option. And at ultra settings, they all dropped below 60 FPS average. Yet the 6500 XT remains ahead. So a win for the 6500 XT, you might think. No, the Radeon 6500 XT failed to load textures properly. Doors would have holes in, or textures would remain at PS1 quality almost indefinitely. So I can't accept that the 6500 XT handled this game the best. The frame rate was always playable, it's just that these sorts of texture issues got worse the higher the preset that I used. So ironically, keeping the game on lowest preset made it run the fastest and look the best out of the three presets I tested. Not a great start for this newest $200 card, which has actually had its specs gimped enough for it to visually fail in this game, even if it was still playable. Kingdom Come Deliverance is an older game. Looks a little rough around the edges, yet is still oddly beautiful in its own ugly kind of way. And all three cards were well up to the challenge of running this game at lowest and at optimized presets, and I'd deem all to be playable at maximum settings too, if not quite achieving 60 FPS. Which isn't terrible for this kind of game, especially given how needlessly excessive the maximum experimental settings are in this game, and in most others. The 6500 XT performed the best of the three at these maximum settings. Deus Ex Mankind Divided, and I will continue to test this game until we receive a newer Deus Ex game that I can play and test. As it is, this stands as being the challenging title from the Radeon 480's era of games. The 6500 XT was the only card to achieve 60 average FPS in this game when maxed out. And yes, that includes 16 times anisotropic filtering. However, when things got tough, its 1% minimums did drop lower than the other cards did, though not by enough for me to actually care about too much. It was all pretty playable. Now for another game based on the same engine, Hitman 3. Don't worry, after this the results get more interesting again. This game ran better on each newer generation of card that I tested. I suspect because they exchange base stats for higher clock speeds, and Hitman apparently loves as many hurts as he can inflict. To the point where, at lowest settings, it was the Radeon 480 that was struggling most with its 1% minimums. But still beyond 60 FPS, so totally playable. The only other interesting thing I noticed about this game, besides the 6500 XT generally being the best, was that its 1% lows started to trail off at maximum settings. But all in all, it was still a very playable result. Doom Eternal. I have covered this one before, pointing out how the Radeon 6500 XT really struggles with it, especially when limited to PCIe 3. But even on PCIe 4, its 4GB of VRAM restrict this card to medium texture settings at most, so it's literally incapable of maxing this game out. So I made the decision to swap maximum settings in this game for maximum settings but only medium texture, just so I could still compare the 6500 XT to the others in this game. Shout out to the 5500 XT here, which has been quietly getting on and making games playable. It pulls ahead of the 480 and well ahead of the 6500 XT in this title, though all cards tore through this game at lowest settings 720p, as you probably expect them to. And I'd say they even had what it takes for my optimised preset, being medium everything at 1080p. But even here, the 6500 XT is starting to show signs of struggling, and this crippled little card slipped down to unpleasant frame time territory once we ramped everything up to Ultra Nightmare. Apart from the medium texture detail, obviously. It's ironic that one of the best performing games in recent times challenges this card the most. Well, almost the most. Because now we get on to Jedi Survivor. This AMD sponsored game runs like ass, especially on the AMD Radeon 6500 XT, which remains the most interesting card of the three to test. None of these cards like this game, and on the Radeon 480 and 5500 XT, I'd recommend the lowest settings and probably a resolution lower than 1080p. Whatever you do, I would strongly advise you use FSR of some sort. But even when I gave it a fighting chance, the 6500 XT still managed just 42 FPS average and 22 FPS lows. It was not pleasant. That's about the same result as the 5500 XT achieved at maximum settings. So I'd consider Jedi Survivor to be the first game I've encountered that the 6500 XT actually can't play acceptably at all, and the results for this card slip into slideshow territory at the higher presets. I thought I was stupid for struggling to run my benchmarking route in this game on higher settings, but it turns out that higher settings adds more shrubs and trees to the environment, which was making my test route harder and harder to traverse. Still, it really is impressive how similar the Radeon 480 and 5500 XT cards perform in this game, with both managing to hold onto a sort of playable experience at all the presets tested, but favouring lower settings for a smoother experience. This game is heavily resolution dependent, so using FSR2 is all but essential on this tier of graphics cards for freeing up enough performance for a smooth result. But like I said, even this isn't enough for the 6500 XT, and I'm not sure which part of the card is causing the bottlenecking here. I accidentally tested Control twice, once at DirectX 11 and another at DirectX 12. Curiously, the 480 and 5500 XT preferred DirectX 11, while the newer 6500 XT did better at 12, and it helped to significantly improve its 1% minimums on all the presets that I tested. I didn't bother testing ray tracing in this game, or on any other for that matter, what with only the 6500 XT supporting it, and with this card struggling enough without it on already. But yeah, all cards ran this game at triple-digit FPS at low settings and about 60 FPS at medium. Take your pick. And last, Cyberpunk 2077. You may notice I've shown very little gameplay footage in this video. This isn't some sort of conspiracy. I used an external capture card, I captured it all properly so as not to impact frame rates at all, but most of the footage corrupted like you're seeing here. Just thought I'd let you know. And wait until you hear what the audio sounds like. So I'll try and figure out why this is happening in case I make future videos like this, but that's why I'm showing benchmarks for most of this video instead of in-game footage that looks like this. I don't want to sound like a broken record, but all cards ran low settings rather well. The 6500 XT struggled at medium, and at Ultra none of them were that playable, but the 5500 XT was the best of the bunch. Notice how little I've said about the Radeon 480. That's because this card might not be that fast, but it's consistent and reliable, handling each test thrown at it as you'd expect from a product of this caliber to perform. Now, listen to how much I've said about the 6500 XT. It is a wild ride with that card. To try and put it into real terms, here is how I'd choose to game with each of these cards based on their genre and how much their gameplay favours higher frame rates. The Radeon 480 and 5500 XT may as well be identical, but the 6500 XT often drops down by one preset, especially in newer and more demanding titles. Oddly enough, in older games, and even in newer ones at lower presets, it can often perform better than the other two cards do. It's just that when the going gets tough, those 1% lows are less consistent. It's not like the good old days where a card simply wasn't fast enough, or was obviously VRAM starved. It really is a complicated beast, which itself works against it because I ended up not trusting it as much as the others. And even when it was running fine, I was wondering how close to its limits it was being pushed, and whether it was going to betray me by suddenly lagging out during a particularly critical moment in a boss fight. In real terms, here are all the numbers. And the percentages here are how each card performs at each preset versus the Radeon 480. Hence why the 480 is always 100%. At low settings, both the 5500 and 6500 XT are about 15% faster than the Radeon 480 is. As we increase the settings, the 5500's advantage shrinks but remains ahead, while the 6500 eventually becomes slower than the 480 is, but only by 6%, on average. But that's missing the important bit. For if we look at the 1% lows, we see something very nasty happening with the 6500 XT, which drops below the 1% lows of the Radeon 480 at optimized preset, and even further still at maximum settings. It's still 82% of it, which doesn't sound too bad until you look up the individual game results and discover that Jedi Survivor ran at just 40% the minimum speed that the 480 did. And of the two major wins it had over the older card, one of them was in Hogwarts Legacy, where it didn't even load the textures properly. In fact, screw that, let's remove that result. It doesn't deserve it. You see, even when the 6500 XT's frame rates are higher than the 480's are, it doesn't make much of a difference because the 480 is still kind of okay. But when it runs slower than the 480 does, it makes for an unpleasant and choppy experience. And that's why the 6500's inconsistent lows is a big, problematic kind of deal. But that's at ultra settings, which I dislike. Time for minimum settings now, which I dislike slightly less. And it tips it more in the newer card's favour. I'll even give the 6500 XT the benefit of the doubt in Hogwarts Legacy, since the texture popping is far less than it was at maximum settings. Jedi Survivor is now the only game that it truly fails to run. In other words, it might not be pretty, but the 6500 XT will still let you play the rest of these games. But the real issue with this card isn't that it can't run games, because most of the time it can. It's just that it isn't consistent, and it doesn't feel like you can rely on it to deliver its tier of performance. And there's no way that you can know how it will perform in a game until you've tested it in that particular game. Add to that its lack of video encoding, its paltry 4GB of VRAM, and it's clearly the worst option on this list. And this has all been tested at PCIe 4. Testing a motherboard limited to 3 would have been even worse for this card. It will be remembered as being one of the worst graphics cards ever released. Yet I still believe it was the best purchase that most people could have made, if they had to buy something during that generation. Reviews of a card before release can't anticipate what will happen after, and because of that, I think they did this card dirty. A review typically comes out before a product is released, so reviewers only have a product's performance to go on, and its suggested price. But when the price turns out to be a total lie, the reviews are missing one half of a very important equation. So in the era of the 6500 XT, most new cards got reasonably positive reviews for being more powerful than the previous generations were. And then, if we were lucky, there would be a small note somewhere saying how it would probably cost more than its MSRP. Bit of an understatement there. Meanwhile, the 6500 XT's reviews spent their whole time criticising its price performance offering, and then even criticised its price, predicting that it would sell for more than its MSRP, even though in reality it didn't. Or at least by nowhere near as much as every other card did. It really bore the brunt of criticism across the board. So it's not that reviewers were wrong about the rating of the 6500 XT, it's more that they should have revised their thoughts once all other cards had doubled from their reviewed price, whereas the 6500s stayed far closer to its MSRP. Here in England, it was meant to be £200 and was widely available for £200. Yet come its release, it had already been decided that this card shouldn't be bought, and reviewers were unintentionally aiding with the notion that you needed to spend at least $500 for a budget graphics card, else you were getting ripped off. The irony. And when every product is going to rip you off, the cheapest rip-off has its own special quality. According to TechSpot's February 2022 prices, the 6500 XT was $270. Going for the 6600 instead would have cost you twice as much. Even the GeForce 3050 was $460. Your only hope of matching the 6500 XT's value proposition was to go to the second-hand market and to pick yourself up a card that could have been approaching 5 years of age already. Even the 5500 XT would have set you back $340. Second-hand. Though, if you could find a GeForce 1070 for $307, then I'd definitely have gone for that instead. But bear in mind, used, 5 years old, subject to availability and no warranty. It's not exactly fair to compare that with a new product. But things are now finally beginning to improve, and after years of total stagnation and even regression, you can now buy a faster graphics card for less money than ever before. And about time. For the 6500 XT's original $200 asking price, you can now grab yourself the far superior Radeon 6600, complete with 8GB of VRAM and none of the 6500's shortcomings. It's still hardly exciting, but it's no longer such a severe compromise. And all those people who bought a 6500 XT to tide themselves over until now have a choice. Maybe they find its performance to be fine for what they use it for, and they'll stick with it. Nothing wrong with that. If you spend most of your time browsing the internet and playing older or 2D games, then you got the same experience and saved a ton of money over all those people doing the same thing on their $1,500 Radeon 6900s or GeForce 3080s. You could splash out on a Radeon 6950 now for $600, still saving yourself well over $500 in total and leaving you with a spare graphics card to boot. I've used my 6500 XT in backup PCs and for LAN parties, because it fits into cases where my 480 cannot, and it uses less power. I hosted a LAN with friends, and sure, we had our kicks, joking and memeing about who would be unfortunate enough to get the PC with the 6500 XT in it, but it had no problem running any of the games that we played, and we even had fun seeing how high we could ramp the settings in Ready or Not before the card started to struggle. FSR 2 goes a long way. Though sadly, it's still not enough to help in Jedi Survivor, which is the only game so far that I'd deem to be unpleasantly unplayable using the 6500 XT, no matter the settings used. But I suspect the number will grow as this console generation matures. We no longer need this caliber of card. The real winners are the people who bought the Radeon 480 back in 2016. Actually, screw that. The real winners are the people who bought the GeForce 1080 and 1080 Ti 6 years ago, and who are still easily running most games at high settings. The Radeon 480 was only good with hindsight because nothing has come along since that has offered significantly more for less money. It's a sad state of affairs all round for budget buyers. Oh yeah, I tested the 5500 XT as well. Kind of forgot about that card, being kind of like a middle sibling that is well behaved and does what it should, and is totally ignored for that reason. When I bought it recently, it still cost me £120, which isn't amazing, but it shows that there are cheap alternatives to the 6500 XT out there if you get lucky with a second-hand deal and don't mind the additional risk of buying something slightly older and second-hand. 7 years after the Radeon 480, we're still waiting for its official $200 successor. A new $200 graphics card hero that pushes the price-performance curve and that remains good enough to power modern games without breaking the bank. The Radeon 7600 and GeForce 4060 should have been $200 cards and will probably end up having the prices slashed repeatedly until they drop to that kind of level. Add to that the inflation we've had recently, and I'd argue that, at a push, the Radeon 7600 could be considered the new $200 card. AMD just missed a trick by not selling it as that in the first place.